Hey everyone, happy Sunday. I have been seeing a lot of celebratory content related to the Inflation Reduction Act that recently passed both houses of Congress. And I wanted to share some thoughts about it and just kind of reflect a little bit on its significance, what it means as far as projection of the midterms, and just what it tells us about the overall state of the Democratic Party. So, if you're not familiar, the Inflation Reduction Act is essentially a watered down version of a watered down version of a watered down version of what was previously known as Build Back Better, which was President Biden's initial agenda to transform the social and economic safety nets in our country. It was created to reimagine the social fabric of society and create the biggest investments in basically and working class people and families and everyday Americans since FDR, essentially, since the New Deal. And I won't go into the whole drama of it. I'm sure if you're watching this, you're probably already familiar with it anyway. But the bill largely was obstructed by two Democratic senators, Joe Manchin and Kristen Sinema. Um, Honestly, probably to a larger degree, Joe Manchin, who it was revealed was essentially negotiating in bad faith the entire time. And the bill sort of officially died, although when I say that, I mean they decided to look at it as a hopeless situation and not do anything to actually try to move the situation forward as of early this year, like February, March ish, I believe. Maybe it was even a little bit before that, but anyway. And then somehow, I guess, leader Chuck Schumer, who's the current Senate Majority Leader, has stayed in contact with the people in Joe Manchin's office, and somehow things kind of happened really quickly where negotiations came back up, and then they were basically able to reach some kind of a deal. But it was all sort of framed around inflation, which is why the name has changed to the Inflation Reduction Act. I think in part because inflation is what in politics they would call a kitchen table topic or issue, because it's something that the average voter is feeling the effects of, is worried about, and is looking to their elected officials to address. And it's something that almost inarguably is going to have political implications in this case, the midterm elections. And probably in a bad way, where typically, typically anyway, in a midterm, almost always, the pendulum swings in the other direction. So, like in this case, where all three branches of government are controlled by Democrats, it would swing to the direction of Republican control. Obviously, not in the executive branch because that's not being decided, but at least as far as like the House or the Senate, or maybe both, likely both. And it's something that really I think we've been bracing for the entire year. And because inflation hasn't really been adequately addressed, I know that the Fed has been increasing interest rates to try to address that, but it hasn't really actually done much. And I think honestly, though, part of it is that this whole conversation is really not framed correctly. So there is some inflation that is happening. And the official like inflation rate is something like 8 or 9%. But let me explain why I say that. The inflation is sort of inflated. um, First of all, the actual inflation that is going on um, is almost exclusively due to different effects of the pandemic. And those effects really are in the supply chain and in the ways that the supply chain has been impacted in all kinds of different ways that basically are making it more difficult and less procedural to actually just move like goods through um, our sort of globalized system. And as a result, prices are higher and it's costing like more money to do business. Okay. And almost all the research has found that that's why inflation is happening. And in a large part, our supply chains are projected out into the future. So, like the goods and services currently moving through ports or being shipped overseas, all of that has been mapped out like a year plus in advance. So it took us a while to actually see and really feel, quite literally, the economic results of the pandemic because, like, in March and April and May, and there were some things like everyone probably remembers the toilet paper shortage and things like that. But overall, it took a really long time to actually see those effects because things are planned out so far into the future. And it wasn't, and a lot of it was like actually feeling the impacts of the disruption that happened in like March, April, May that happened actually in the next year where we actually felt those effects. So a lot of it and really has to do with the pandemic. There's a misconception and a myth. Well, and it's something that Republicans are pushing, of course, because the rhetoric fits into their agenda, but there's a myth that all of the social spending and the, you know, actual investment in the American people that took place over 2020 and 2021 actually caused inflation because we put all this money into circulation that wasn't previously there. And so, because of that, it drove the prices up because, the more supply that you have, in this case of dollars, the less demand that creates. And so then, oh wait, more dollars. Like, I understand economics. Um, More supply, and then, oh, I'm sorry, it's worth less because the more money you have in circulation, the less that it's worth. Sorry. Okay. Um, and a lot of that also is just based on kind of old school macroeconomic theory because the reality is we don't like print money in the same way, and so much of how monetary policy happens just doesn't follow those rules anymore. And it, it also has just been proven time and time again. There's so many studies that have documented this. It All of that spending really didn't do anything as far as causing inflation or leading to some kind of like um effect that resulted in inflation. Not at all. And of course, it's always convenient that the social spending and investment in average Americans, which it happened for people on unemployment, happened through the child tax credit, happened through the American Rescue Plan, through the $2,000 checks, the all of the COVID relief, basically, that happened in different forms. Um, of course, that is what is blamed on these issues versus something like the PPP loans, for example, or the billions that were spent on bailing out the airlines, even though they acted in completely bad faith and found all of these wheelie ways to avoid completely laying off their workers, but yet they're still understaffing and purposefully scheduling flights they know that they actually don't have the labor to fly, which is a whole other topic. But of course, none of those things ever get cited as these spending problems that could have led to increased inflation. There's no evidence that those things did either, but none of it adds up. Like, quite literally doesn't add up. So there's that, okay? And then there's the other fact, the other side of this coin, no pun intended, um, is corporate price gouging, is corporate greed, and the rampant effects of wealth inequality and the growing gap between the very few at the top and everyone else. And we're very quickly approaching Gilded Age levels of wealth inequality in this country, which the Gilded Age is the time where there was the most wealth inequality historically. And and when I say approaching, I mean like in a couple of years, it's projected that we will reach that point. And the pandemic vastly exacerbated that wealth gap because the rich got very rich, or very much richer as a result of the pandemic, and everyone else got screwed. It was really good for big business and really bad for everyone else. And as a result of that, I mean, and we already were in a bad position as far as that goes, and especially in terms of corporate consolidation, the amount and the sheer uh, capacity of mergers and acquisitions that have been happening in the past 2 or 3 decades, and the increasing amount of consolidated power, because most industries at this point have like 3 or 4 companies that run everything, and there might even be people have done different mappings of this, but even though like let's say if you go to the store and it's like, what are you talking about? I could buy Cheerios, I could buy like Life cereal, I could buy Cinnamon Toast Crunch, I could buy Fruity Pebbles, or like there's different brands, or like Tide and Gain and Seventh Generation and Febreze, or whatever in the like cleaning product department. A lot of those brands are owned by a couple of big parent companies, and like Johnson and Johnson is one that owns like a shit ton of stuff, and Procter and Gamble is another one. Um, and so it's almost even this kind of like false sense of competition or diversity within products, when really it's a couple brands that kind of own everything. And across most industries, this is true. There's like 3 or 4 big players. It's true in airlines. It's true in beverages. It's true in like cosmetics. It's true literally in almost every category. And because of that, the players have so much power and leverage. Because if they decide, if one of those 3 or 4 companies, let's just take beverage as a category in this example, and like let's just say like soda and like soft drinks. So if one of those companies decides we're going to raise prices, then they basically have the such a dominant position in the market that their decision to raise prices doesn't actually impact the demand in the ways that it should, or like we typically would expect, through economic theory. And also the brands kind of a lot of times will work in cahoots, where it's like, one's raising their prices 5 cents, and then rather than competing for the customer, the other will decide to also raise their prices by 5 cents, because they know that people won't really have much of a choice as far as like where they're buying their soda or who they're buying their soda from. And so the price is going to go up. And also, Another big thing that happened during the pandemic in big business is that um, CEO profits and even as far as like stock buybacks and boards of these different companies have gotten inordinately wealthy, and it's the like average CEO pay has increased by leaps and bounds in just a couple of years. And there's so many stats of and examples of companies that like either laid off workers and gave huge bonuses to their CEOs, or refused to give anybody else in the company a raise, and are now crying inflation, but then are paying $20 million as a bonus to their CEO. Most of these companies that what is happening is they're saying it's inflation, and they're using inflation as an excuse and as sort of like a veil to mask what's really going on. And what they're really doing is simply raising prices because they can, and especially because the pandemic was really hard on the smallest of businesses. Um, they just have so much control that they can raise prices and basically have like no impact other than like increased profits. And there's record profits throughout most of these big businesses. Um, so it has really nothing to do with inflation. And they could also, even if there was, like, is there some inflation? Yes, but can those companies afford to just honestly eat that inflation cost? Absolutely. They could, with the amount that they're profiting, um, they could just eat the costs related to inflation and still be much more profitable than they were pre 2020. Like, it has nothing to do with inflation, and they're choosing to pass those costs, any of those costs, onto the consumer and then inflate the inflation costs, which is leading to more inflation. So, and there's tons of evidence. Like Robert Reich is an economist who I adore. He does really great work around this. I would highly recommend checking out his stuff. um, he's done a lot of really great work and research around this. It's disgusting, but it's a smoke and mirrors situation where, and of course, the Republicans who are funded by these folks, um, are pointing the finger at the people who got unemployment as the reason that costs are rising, instead of the actual reason, which is because of corporate greed, is because of the ownership class, using their power in egregious ways. So, getting back then, I feel like that was kind of a long tangent to the Inflation Reduction Act. I don't even like the renaming of it because to me, it's playing into this Republican rhetoric. I just explained why this idea of inflation right now is largely garbage and largely built on a glass house, or is largely a glass house itself. Um, Basically, because of that, it's not even real, right? But of course, because of all the Republican rhetoric out there, the average person thinks of it in this like typical inflation sort of way. And they're trying to say like, hey, you know, you're hurting right now because of inflation. We did something about it, and they're trying to use that as a way to cash in political points. Will it be effective? I guess that remains to be seen. Um, but I am against the renaming of it, and I think it's ridiculous. It seems to be the only way that they were able to get Manchin on board, but all of his concern and all the things that he went on all the Sunday shows and talked about was basically how, I mean, and it is true that the spending that's going to happen is already paid for, and a lot of that has to do with increased IRS enforcement, and things like that. But uh, basically actually increasing the ability to go after tax cheats. And not your average person. We're talking about people with like fucking millions and millions of dollars here. Um, and increasing the corporate tax rate basically back to 28% in most cases, although a lot of the really good aspects as far as funding this stuff were cut out because of Kristen Cinema. Like there's some specific things where like hedge fund uh, hedge funds were going to be taxed at an increasing rate, but then they had to like back off of those things because Kristen Cinema, who's funded by these folks in private equity, wouldn't agree to it. And yeah, so anyway, it was supposed to even pay for itself even more than it actually is, but I digress. So I think the name is bad though, because still, if you're still playing into their hands, which I think is just never a good idea, and it sort of validates these talking points in a way that says that they're legitimate when they're not. Legitimizing this kind of rhetoric, it's not only stupid, but it's honestly dangerous. So there's that. And then there's just the fact of how whittled down the whole thing actually was. Because from the original Build Back Better platform, we only got like two or three of those things in the Inflation Reduction Act, which are the climate provisions, um, the increased sort of funding, like subsidiary funding for um, healthcare for people who are reliant on the ACA free market to buy health insurance, which I'll explain in a second. And then yeah, like the increased IRS enforcement and taxing of the wealthy and of corporations. So his original Build Back Better, I mean, it was a massive. It had increased funding for Medicare, adding dental, vision, and hearing into Medicare, universal pre-K, uh, child care, the child tax credit, um, so many other things that I'm even forgetting that were part of it. And tuition free community college, a bunch of things. And we're not, paid family leave, I think also universal child care, lots of things, okay? And, we got like three of them. And the amount of spending even on this bill, I believe, is somewhere in the 400 to $500 billion range. Sounds like a lot, but the initial Build Back Better was something like $6 trillion. So we're talking like 95% more than this bill is. And even the whittled down version of Build Back Better was somewhere around like 3 trillion. So still we're talking about like a 12th of what that was, or like a 10th. Okay, like to me this is Manchin pulling the wool over these people's eyes, giving them like a tiny fucking crumb and then just playing right into his hand and being so thankful and being so grateful and looking at this as a huge political victory when to me it's really kind of just business as usual. And to talk a little bit about the healthcare provisions, really those are actually just an extension of what we already have, because through the American Rescue Plan, which was like President Biden's like kind of COVID relief bill, that was one of the first things that he did when he was in office in 2021. So as part of that, they expanded the funding for subsidies for the ACA. So they expanded eligibility, because before it was really only if you were like super low income could you get a subsidy to pay for the premiums. And now it's pretty much if you're in the middle class, even like you'll probably qualify for something. And basically those subsidies fund the premium costs of your insurance. So if you sign up, like let's say you sign up for a plan and the premiums are $300 a month, and then let's say you qualify for $200 a month of subsidies, they'll go ahead and directly pay that $200 a month to the insurer that you choose on the free market, and then you're only paying $100 a month instead of $300. So it makes healthcare more affordable, and a lot of healthcare is not affordable. We all know Those plans also on the free market tend to be a joke, and they tend to be really unaffordable. So, because I think really the big issue for a long time was like, okay, there's the ability to buy health insurance, but there's not the money to buy health insurance. And this really expanded that by cutting the costs for, the consumer, um, for the person. And I even hate saying consumer in this context, but yeah. So that's been in place since 2021. And this is really just extending that same like framework, because it was going to expire at the end of this year. So now that's in place for another 3 years. So until I think so 2023, 24, 25. Um, so it's really not giving us anything new. It's just continuing, the great but still not amazing and not transformative version of healthcare that we have, and like assistance in paying for healthcare. So I've talked for 26 minutes, but just in general, guys, like it's so frustrating, because I do think obviously passing something is better than passing nothing. Is do I think and I think the marketing job that the Democrats have been doing on this is good. I think they've been inflating, no pun intended, the impacts that this bill is going to have, just in general. And I do think they've been doing a decent job at that, but is it going to have some kind of transformative effect? I don't think so. In any sense of the word, I don't think so. But I think for a lot of different reasons, the midterms, my personal prediction is I think for a bunch of different reasons, the midterms are almost going to be somewhat of a wash. Like, I think the Republicans might take control of the House, which I would be bad, but I think that's very possible. But I almost feel like the effects of like January 6th and Roe and all these different things, they are adding up. And I think it's going to result in, it's not going to be the bloodbath that we thought it would be at the beginning of the year and that the Republicans were hoping for and trying to create. So, anyway, those are my thoughts. Happy Sunday. Peace and love.